Hey, this is Glenn Loury at Brown University. Gee, Bill, talking to you, I'm almost ashamed to say that. At Brown University and the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, and I'm talking with William Deresiewicz, who is an independent writer living in Portland, Oregon, and formerly a professor of English at Yale University. Welcome to the Glenn Show, Bill.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we're here because you've written this book, Excellent Sheep: The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. And I just have had an opportunity to look at it more than casually, though I must admit that I haven't read every single word. But I've read enough of it to see that it's going to shake up, or probably some of the essays that you published from it already have shaken up, a lot of people. And just wanted to spend a little bit of time here talking about your argument in the book, how people have reacted to it, and things of that kind.
Sure.
So, American higher education, at least American higher education, is in trouble. Maybe I could get us started. That's your claim. Maybe I could get us started by just quoting briefly from something I read in the introduction of the book. You're talking about elite education, and you address yourself to the question, who are this elite? And I quote, upper echelons of our society, the whole cohort of people who went to selective colleges and are running society for their own exclusive benefit, whose time to leave the stage of history has now so evidently come.
Yeah.
Man.
I know. That's sort of the biggest claim, or the biggest statement that kind of frames the whole book. I mean, the book is about universities.
Yeah.
It's especially about the kids who get into them and what the process of getting into them requires them to be. But ultimately, it's an implicit and sometimes explicit portrait of that elite class, and I'm careful there to distinguish the word elite from the way it's come to be used, especially on the right, as a cudgel with which to beat certain segments of the elite, liberal opinion makers on the coasts. But I mean everybody in the elite, the people who run society, and I would, the 10% really, professionals, managers, people who go to selective colleges, not just the Ivy League. The meritocracy, right? That's really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And meritocracy was a great thing when it was instituted. I mean, you and I, people like us, were excluded from the elite and from the colleges that certified people as members of the elite. Women were excluded, pretty much everybody except white Anglo-Saxon prep school boys.
Yeah.
And that was a huge and really courageous change in the 60s. It culminated in the 60s, that replaced that old WASP aristocracy with multicultural meritocracy. The problem is that gradually, but increasingly, over the last 40 or 50 years, that meritocracy has figured out how to make itself hereditary by evolving the system in the direction of tougher and tougher. Well, I don't know. I'm going to say more and more manic admission standards. I'm not sure they're good. I don't think they're good admission standards, but they require more and more and more from kids, which in turn requires more and more affluence from parents to be able to send their kids through them. And we can look at the statistics. Socioeconomic stratification at selective colleges is very bad, and it's getting worse. And then on top of that, I think if we look, as many people have, I think maybe as we all have, if we look at the elite that we have, the adult elite that we have, and how it's been running society for the last at least 10, 15 years, but I think the truth is it's been a lot longer than that. Yeah. Across our institutions, whether it's government, Wall Street, corporations, nonprofits, the universities themselves, we have an elite that's largely failing. And it's failing in exactly the way you would predict from the way that it's been trained as kids, right? The adult elite looks exactly like my excellent sheep, who are the kids who go to these schools. Uh, it's intellectually narrow, technocratic, risk averse, unimaginative, timid. It's also very self-serving, and at the same time very self-satisfied. There's this whole rhetoric of moral superiority and entitlement. And it's also cut off from the people it's supposed to lead.
Bill, let me interrupt you.
Yeah.
There's so
Yeah, go
much
ahead.
on the table here, and
Yeah.
it might be helpful just to kind of parse it a little bit.
Sure.
So on the one hand, there's this social reproduction point. Let me call it that. There's this point about how a class, a ruling class, constitutes and reproduces itself over time through the generations. And one fascinating to me dimension of your wide argument is that there is a lot of similarity between the old school waspish, what it was like in the 1920s, 1930s, or whatever. Not too many Jews. Let's have gentlemen. Kind of clubbable social reproduction of an American elite of that era, and the system that you're indicting, with which we are beset now, which is more meritocratic. I take note of your the role that Kingman Brewster played in the 1960s in transforming Yale as a case study of this more general shift, but that we find ourselves nevertheless in a world of, in its own way, narrowly socially reproduced hereditary elitism, but of a different mechanism for how it's done, but some of the same kind of qualities to it. So that's one thing I think deserves to be highlighted.
Right. Yeah. As you say, the mechanisms of reproduction are different. Although it's interesting, the continuities between the old standards that were designed to keep out the Jews and the new. I mean, a lot of that's the stuff that we do in the admissions process still dates from that, like interviews and things like that.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, substantially, the method of reproduction is different, but the effect is the same. The method now is actually a lot of what I talk about, because instead of just being born into the right class and being ushered through, you went to Groton and you went from Groton to Harvard. Now, these kids have to kill themselves to become the kinds of people who get in to Harvard. But in order to be able to do that, families have to be affluent, right? I mean, the way someone else put it in a book called Creating a Class, which I think is it's about an admissions process at a liberal arts college, but it's a great title because it's creating a class in a larger sense. Right, I want to make sure our readers get it, our viewers get it. What he says is that the college admissions process is the way of laundering privilege. It's the way of laundering privilege, right? So yeah, the kids have to do all this stuff, but their opportunity to do it is itself created by privilege. So it's sort of the worst of both worlds in a sense, because we have the same social reproduction that the WASPs did, but we're driving our kids crazy in the way that the WASP didn't have to do. And I think, listen, I'm not nostalgic for the WASP aristocracy, but I think in many ways, at least some of them, displayed qualities of leadership that we don't have anymore. And I mean real leadership. That word has become such an empty cliche on campuses and in general now, and it really just means being in charge. But it used to actually mean something, and it meant things like duty and responsibility and self-sacrifice and a sense of stewardship of institutions, and not just, and
honor.
And honor.
May I say that?
Yeah. You can say that. Yeah, I know it's an old-fashioned
now,
word.
What about patriotism? No, I'm trying to get to the edgy part of what I hear you arguing right now, because there was more there than just beauty.
Yeah, I mean, honor and patriotism aren't words that I use, but they're not words that I would disavow either, especially if patriotism is understood not as the last refuge of scoundrels, but a real sense that my country is more important than me. My country is more important than my class, and therefore my ultimate uh, um, motivation is to make the country a better place. Uh, I don't, or at least hand it on in no worse condition than I inherited it. And I really don't see that among I mean, there used to be a sense of corporate responsibility.
Right.
You had fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders, but it wasn't the only responsibility you had. That seems to be completely lost now.
Now, so you've identified a problem with the meritocratic institutions, and you've identified a circumstance in society, or in this case, the failures of leadership. What, in your mind, is the connection between hyper-competitive admissions and success-oriented 4 years at college, on the one hand, and I don't know, a corporate leadership class who no longer can see beyond the quarterly income reports?
Right. And again, not just corporate. I mean, I think it's true at nonprofits, government as well, across our institutions. I mean, that's the question.
Technocratic, unimaginative, overly cautious. I mean, again, these are my words, but I'm wondering if that's not what you're trying.
No, they were my words too. I mean, you get it exactly right. I mean, there's a clear connection between the people the kids are trained to become just to get into prestigious universities, basically hoop jumpers who are always, first of all, only thinking about, you said the next quarter if you're a CEO, but they're only thinking about their next, marking period, let's say. They're thinking about the next test. And at the same time, everything they're doing is exclusively for the advancement of their own career. I mean, that's I don't even think it occurs to anybody anymore that there may be some other goal. So, the mentality is inculcated right from the beginning. Everything you're doing for yourself. There may be a rhetoric of service. There may be a rhetoric of giving back. I think everybody knows that it's just rhetoric. To me, the perfect example was Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP. Because I mean, he's English, but this is not just an American phenomenon. And if you remember, he said, "Hey, I'm suffering too. I want my life back."
I remember
during
that.
the Gulf oil spill.
He took a lot of grief for that too, but yeah, he did say it.
Well, he did, because I think once people come out and say these things, everyone sees how heinous they are. Whether it's the CEO of Goldman saying like, we're doing great things for America. Yeah. But this is the attitude, right? And I think it's the attitude across the board. I think it's the attitude of the college president who makes $2 million at a time when, he's paying adjuncts $3,000 a course. I mean, everybody has their own justifications. That's what's so insidious about it. Nobody thinks they're doing bad. But we've evolved a system of justifications that I think is completely out of whack.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a minute. I don't know how many seats there are at the, quote, very best, close quote, liberal arts colleges and research universities in the country, but it's a limited number. Yeah. I don't know if that's necessary or if that's a decision that we've made that could be changed. That is, we could have twice or 5 times as many super high quality college, capacity than what we have. But given that it's limited, access to it has to be rationed. We're not going to flip a coin here. Any mechanism that one introduces for rationing will induce, kind of teach to the test kinds of responses from the public at large who will want access to the limited capacity of these institutions. They will do whatever they need to do to make themselves more presentable to whatever the mechanism is that rations their access to these institutions. So are you not tilting at a windmill? I'm being devil's advocate now. By complaining about the fact that there's competition. Well, of course there's going to be competition. There's 1 seat for every 5 people who want one. By complaining about the fact that people do the things they need to do in order to get over their hurdle, maybe we should have them do different things, but there will always be a hurdle, etc. You see where I'm going with this?
I do. So let me say a few things. First of all, to your last point, there will always be hurdles, but what the hurdles are can make a big difference in how kids are brought up and who they become. We are pushing kids in the direction of conformity, cynicism about their education. We could at least begin to try to devise admission standards that would encourage kids to take risks and not be afraid of failure. That would mean not evaluating everybody strictly on the basis of GPA. Real intellectual curiosity and independence of thought instead of giving the teachers the answer they want. But I agree with you. Wealthy families are always going to figure out how to game the system. So to me, the only real answer is to address what you started your question with, which is the scarcity of educational resources because there are a limited number of seats at selective private colleges and universities. And those schools haven't gotten very much bigger in the last couple of generations, whereas the country's gotten a great deal bigger, and we also now have a larger percentage of international students. Yeah. My ultimate recommendation, and I know people might see this as politically utopian, is to bypass the system of private selective higher education and eliminate the artificial scarcity of educational resources by building our public universities back up to where they once were. And I emphasize where they once were because we once made this commitment. We once built at taxpayer expense, high quality. I mean, when Nelson Rockefeller, as governor of New York, decided to undertake an enormous expansion of the state university system, he said that he wanted every citizen of the state to have a chance to have the same college education he had. Now, he went to Dartmouth. We did this once. Other countries do it. Other countries have high-quality, low-cost public higher education for everybody who's capable of doing the work and making the grade.
By the way, these would be mega University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan style research universities, or these would be a large number of liberal arts colleges scattered across the state's landscape rather than, all concentrated in Ann Arbor.
Look, there could be many different models. I mean, I'm not wedded to any specific model. Okay. I advocate for liberal arts colleges because I think they're doing things well, but to me the essential thing is not that it necessarily even be a small college, but that the classrooms be small and the teachers be well compensated. The truth is that in some ways we're moving in the direction that you just suggested because as of a few years ago, there were 4 honors colleges at public universities. There's several dozen now. Honors colleges, honors programs. I was just down at one at the University of Mississippi. These are really smart kids. I mean, if you really want to just judge by their average ACT, SAT score, it's comparable to some of the best liberal arts colleges and universities in the country. I mean, if it were a standalone school, it would probably rank, in the top 20 or 30. And there are a lot of honors colleges like this. So the model is not what matters to me. What matters is that they be adequately resourced.
I see. Okay. Now, point of privilege, if I may. I'm an economist.
Sure.
Okay. And I've taught at Harvard, taught here at Brown, taught at Boston University, taught at the University of Michigan. Everywhere I've gone, enrollment in economics departments has been amongst the biggest of the colleges' enrollments, And then you make a remark about this in your book. You point out, I can't remember the statistics offhand, you will.
I can tell you.
What the number of institutions leading both liberal arts colleges and research universities, where economics is the biggest major.
Right.
Now, what's so bad about that? Not only does it keep me working, but I thought we were producing useful knowledge over there in my field. What's so bad about that?
Oh, listen, so first of all, the numbers are that as of about 20 years ago, 8 of the top 40 schools, economics was the top major, and now it's probably 26. It's not always possible to get the exact number in each case, but about 26, which is 60% of the top 40. I don't dispute that the economics field is producing useful knowledge, but as you know, there's a big difference between what a research faculty, the knowledge a research faculty creates, and the undergraduate education that's being delivered. I mean, those are totally separate issues.
Yeah.
So what I see is, why is this happening? It seems pretty clear that it's happening because students have been told relentlessly that they need to get an education that's practical, that's going to get them their first job. And everybody associates economics with practicality. The other big one that's coming up now is computer science. I don't object to any particular kid majoring in either of those things, wanting to become an economist, a professor of economics, a computer scientist. That's all good. Why are they doing it is the question. I think they're doing it because they've been given the wrong idea about what their college education is for. First of all, it's not clear that there's a high correlation between what you major in and how employable you are. In fact, there was a large-scale survey of corporations that was reported on in the Wall Street Journal. It was over 300 corporations, and the headline was, "Your college major is a minor issue." They're looking for skills. They're looking for ability. They're not necessarily looking. I mean, you don't learn that much in college anyway. Let's face it. You have a heck of a lot more to learn. It's all about how your mind is trained and whether you acquire the capacity to teach yourself all the other stuff you're going to need to know once you're on the job. So, I think there's this huge misconception like we have to major in X, we have to major in Y. It has to be practical. What does practicality mean? The fact is that if we're talking about the top 40 schools, to be brutally honest, these kids are all going to get jobs. They're all going to get well-paying jobs. They're all going to have affluent careers. They would have to fall down a well to avoid having that happen to them. But, I could go on. I feel like I'm filibustering.
No. I'm giving you ample time to articulate what you're talking about here.
Look,
we got all these kids majoring in economics and in finance because many of them, they want to get hired by an investment bank on Wall Street or, Arthur Andersen or somebody like that. Right. They're coming from peer groups. I mean, I know these kids, I teach them and, I stay friends with them sometimes after they leave. I know a little bit about what their lives are like as they go on. And they're trying to get to the top of the pile, just as you point out. They want to be making six figures when they leave college or shortly after they leave college. They want an apartment in Manhattan or San Francisco. Right. How are you going to get one of those? Right. They don't want to disappoint their parents, and that's a whole nother set of issues that you deal with, I think, so brilliantly in your book. That what is the kind of psychology of parental instigation of their children's success, and what are the motivations, the complex motivations for parents, and how maybe that ain't so healthy for us, and all of that. But in any case, I'm just saying, they want to succeed, so they do what they think is necessary to succeed, and in the process, they miss getting an education, which is necessary to live well. I think that's what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying, and I would add to that they often miss the opportunity to do something that they find meaningful, that gives them a sense of purpose. Why devote your life simply for the sake of becoming as successful in the most narrowly conventional terms as possible? Where did that motive come from? Is it a good motive to take through your life? My answer is no, but at the very least, I think college should be the place where kids are forced to confront that question. And I don't see that happening. I mean, one thing about private colleges is that they have a very strong incentive to produce at least a critical mass of alumni who become very wealthy. That's not necessarily good for society. It isn't even necessarily good for the alumni who become very wealthy, because I don't think we need to say at this point in human history that great wealth does not necessarily lead to great happiness. But this is part of the problem with relying on private institutions to create our leadership class, instead of public ones that aren't going to be dependent on alumni donations.
That's an interesting point. I was with a colleague of mine recently, just hanging out in the summer, and we got into this conversation about how the admissions office here at Brown recognizes that 10 or 15% of the slots are going to have to be allocated with an eye toward this intergenerational
the
legacy, generosity, cultivating relationships with wealthy people and whatnot. And my colleague's point was, hey, man, that's just the way the bills get paid around here. And I was upset about it, but I think maybe putting my head in the sand a little bit, because as a matter of fact, the bills have to be paid. And it seems now that you're observing, well, what is, we express our collective values and we take care of our public interests that wouldn't be privately served through our public institutions. And yeah, the bills are paid through tax dollars, but they don't have to be paid through the admissions process.
Exactly.
And that
Yeah,
seems
I
fair
mean,
enough.
I listen, everybody's acting, everybody in this system, and it's a big system, which is why I try to talk about a lot of different parts of it in the book, because I think you have to talk about the kids, the parents, the admissions process, the universities. Everyone in this system is sort of acting out of the reasonably based on the incentives they've been given. And the private universities do have to pay their bills. But we don't have to assent to that system. And at the very least, if we know about legacy admissions and all that kind of stuff, let's not pretend that we actually have a meritocracy in this country. A real meritocracy. I mean, let me add, I wish I had said this before in response to an earlier question of yours. When the old, Ivy League WASP institutions opened up their admissions policy, and people like Kingman Brewster at Yale really had to fight his alumni. It was a big battle. Part of the thought was we are wasting most of our nation's talent, and again, we need to put nation above class. All these kids who are not white WASP boys, what's happening to them? Well, I would argue that now we are again wasting large areas of our nation's talent because it is so hard for poor and even middle-class kids to get into top schools and therefore, deploy their talents in at the elite level in service of the country. I mean, I think there's a huge sort of waste of human capital that's going on.
But in saying that, though, excuse me for interrupting,
yeah, please,
are you not
please.
acknowledging that whatever it is that's happening at the top schools is a necessary prerequisite to the full realization of the young people's potential? If those who are not there are therefore not able to deploy their talents and we're not able to get the benefit of them, it sounds like indirectly that's crediting what happens at these institutions.
Well, some things definitely happen at these institutions, and the main thing that happens is that you get plugged into the elite, right? So at the very least, this is the selection grounds for much of our leadership class. But I would even say, look, I mean, it's not just even a matter of poor kids ultimately can't get into the Ivy League except in tiny numbers. They're also being excluded in enormous numbers from our public universities because even those have become too expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me shift a little bit here. Can we go back to talking about parenting? You kind of touched on it, and I've got in my notes somewhere here a sentence or two that you offered about Amy Chua, but I think I'd just as soon let you speak it as to read it out loud. Not even aware of the self-refuting character of her own argument is a rough paraphrase, as I recall. Someone who, is exhibiting everything that's wrong with how they view the world and being proud of it and not even knowing that they're exposing themselves. You guys overlapped at Yale, I would have to assume. Did you know?
Well, she's in the law school. I mean, I wasn't aware of her until Tiger Mom.
So apparently, Tiger Mom had a big impact on you as a negative example of something or something like that. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I mean, first of all, that whole thing was such a striking phenomenon because it really she wasn't just exhibiting herself consciously or unconsciously as the ultimate example of this insane upper middle class parenting, but it became a litmus test for all the other upper middle class parents, I think maybe especially the white ones, who fear that their kids are losing out to the East Asian kids who are more motivated. So it kind of elicited precisely the status anxiety and sort of lunatic parenting philosophies that I'm inveighing against. And that's why I talk about her, because she's a great example of what the problem is. And she also, as you suggested, is blind to the meaning of her own story. It's like reading a novel with an unreliable narrator. She doesn't understand what she's telling us, because she's telling us, among other things, that she rebelled from her parents, even though she thinks that kids should just do what their parents want. That she's telling us that her kids don't have any friends, even though she doesn't seem to realize that because people keep saying it to her, but she can't hear it, etc., etc. It was cathartic for me to read the book just because it brought all this so much into focus, and because I also went through the system. I mean, it wasn't as crazy in the late 70s and early 80s, but, I'm from a Jewish family. My father was an immigrant. My mother was an immigrant. they had these kinds of expectations too, and I saw this among many of my students. A lot of the kids who came to talk to me to say, my parents want X, but I want Y. A lot of them were Asian kids. Um, uh, I think the ultimate, to go back to an earlier question, um, the ultimate job, I think, of a young person, of a young adult, is to separate from their parents, is to separate their desires from their parents' desires, figure out where they start and their parents stop. And I'm afraid that that seems to be getting harder and harder to do, paradoxically, because this generation seems to have a better relationship with their parents. They're friends. They're our friends. And, you see kids calling their mom after every class or whatever it is in college. I think there's this kind of insidious alignment of interests when, in fact, the interests are not aligned. And in order to individuate, you need to separate. And it's a painful process, and it involves disappointing your parents. It might involve infuriating your parents. That's a necessary developmental stage.
You're subversive, my man. I mean, come on.
Well, somebody has to be, right?
I'm the parent of, amongst other children. I have children in their 40s from my first marriage, but I'm a parent of kids in their early, mid-20s. And you're right about the pain of separation, but also absolutely right about the necessity of it. And I don't know that I would ever have been accurately described as a helicopter, hovering, trying to manage and micromanage and, vicariously fulfill myself through my kids' achievements. But I did have to reckon with, my kid kind of doesn't want to finish his undergraduate education, wants to bounce around and, find himself and do something other than, get a BA and an MBA and a PhD or whatever it is, and kind of accepting that it's his life and not mine that we're talking about here. It's pretty tough stuff.
Listen, I know that parents have the hardest job of all in this, and that it's not easy. And I know I'm tough on parents, but listen, I know, and I know it can. Listen, I'm. It's just, it's life, right?
Oh, I mean, excuse me again for interrupting, but
I mean, I know that you understand that.
And there's the other side to it. There's the hyper freedom of the parent who, rather than hovering, does just the opposite and lets the kid do anything they want to do, make any choice that they want to make, and just says, go for it and whatever. And there are no rules and there are no boundaries. And as I recall your observation, it's something like, well, maybe this is a parent for whom that kind of free-spirited living was especially valuable, and now he sort of burdens his child with an insufficient amount of guidance and kind of boundary setting.
Yeah, I'm definitely not advocating sort of free-range parenting either, but we have to be able to strike a balance. And I think, maybe in many ways that sort of intense, hovering upper middle class parenting comes from a fear of that alternative. But like I said, I think striking a balance is the hardest thing. I think it's very easy to just go in one direction or another. But I think that's what kids need.
Let me talk with you a little bit about what your view of the purpose of education is. What's supposed to be happening in college? What it means to be an educated person and to be able to, as it were, discover oneself or create a self and a meaningful life. At the bottom of this is a bunch of kids who are thoroughbred academic athletes in some sense, because that's the only way you can get into a place like Yale. But on the other hand, have no idea about what they're supposed to be trying to do and don't really know how to figure that out, which, as I understand it, is what going to college should equip you to do.
Certainly should begin, right, to equip you to do that. It's a good question. Look, it's the most important question when we talk about college. What's it supposed to be about? Obviously a lot of development happens outside of college, after college. It's not about the classroom. But so what can the classroom do? And I think that what it can do, in addition to all the practical stuff that definitely needs to happen, and that's going to help you make your way in a career afterwards, is nurture and encourage. I wish I'd said it this way in the book. The natural inquisitiveness of youth. I mean, I really think that I mean, without getting into sort of is there a universal human nature, but I mean, at least in our society, it's very natural, comes very naturally to people who are 18 or 16 or 20 to ask questions about life, about the world, to speculate, to want to talk. You know, we talk about late night bull sessions or whatever it is. I think the job of college is to encourage and to guide and to inform that kind of wonderment, that kind of speculation, which ultimately leads towards helping you, as you say, create a self, establish your values. I think psychologists talk about this. We start with certainty as children, we end with convictions as adults. But those two things are not necessarily the same set of things, and it's the job of that passage through adolescence and young adulthood to move from one to the other. You enter a period of disorder and uncertainty, and you try to figure it out. And I think the humanities have a special role to play, but not necessarily only the humanities. I mean, I think any liberal arts discipline, which also includes sciences and social sciences, can help play that role. What I see, because of the messages kids have been getting about education, because of the way curricula are constructed now, is that college doesn't do that, and in many ways inhibits it. Kids are just doing the hoop jumping thing still. They're rushing from one thing to another. They are doing only that which can be put in a resume, only that which furthers the accumulation of credentials. They think that everything has to be practical. They think they have to be leaders. And so they may do the work, they know how to get the A, but that's not the same thing as immersing yourself in a open-ended way into the material of the course, into the stuff that the course is asking you to think about. In a way, this is I think the key, right? I think kids think. Here, let me just take a step back for a second, because I have a friend who's a designer with an MBA and an MFA, and she does really interesting work at the intersection of business and art. And she talks about the difference between design thinking and art thinking. Design thinking means you have a problem, you want to get to B, and you need to figure out how to get from A to B, how to design the product, how to design the ad campaign, whatever it is, and that's fine. Art thinking is different. Art thinking is you don't know where you're getting. You start from A and you don't know where you're going. And the answer can surprise you. And it requires creativity, it requires suspension of certainty. We're teaching kids design thinking. We're teaching kids to go into college and say, I want to be a Wall Street guy, I want to be a doctor, I want to be X or Y. What courses do I need to take to get there? Instead of saying to them, you don't know who you're going to be in 4 years. And you shouldn't hold on to any particular image of who you want to be. You need to let yourself go through this process in an open-ended, risky, exciting way that might land you somewhere you've never dreamed of before, and think how exciting that will be.
Yeah. That's compelling to my ear, though it does have a somewhat romantic quality to it, if I may say so.
Romantic with a capital R. Well, that's fine. You know what? Better a romantic than someone. You know, you got to be something, right?
I remember once. I don't know if this is related or not. You can tell me. There's a kid that is about to go to college, who I'm close to, and he's thinking about doing mathematics in college, and then came to me one day and said, "No, I think I'm going to do business." Okay?
Uh-huh.
And of course, I was crestfallen. I was devastated by this. And then sort of pondering how to react without seeming to be, like a snob, I'm a professor, you have to do that, or without,
Right.
not showing deference and respect to, somebody else's choices in life. But I thought that this was like the worst thing that I could possibly have heard, with apologies to any business majors out there. And so I said, well, do you know what mathematics actually is? And this kid who's very bright, very high SAT scores and everything like that is saying, yeah, it's like calculus, man. It's like problem solving. And I tried to say, no, that's like, the lowest level of it. It's about, and then I tried to present some idea about what I understand mathematics to be about,
Right.
Mention a couple of, how could anybody possibly know this, like logical incompleteness of systems, or, some kind of, here's a theorem. I bet you could, and there's beauty there. And this is like pure cognition. This is like, the ability of our thinking to take, command over stuff. This is about studying relationships. It's about seeing connections between apparently dissimilar, deep structural connections between apparently dissimilar things and things like that. To which the answer was, well, if I wanted to be a philosopher, I would major in philosophy. In other words, I want to get a job when I get out of here.
Right.
Right. But I remember,
right.
I grew up in inner city Chicago and kind of bounced around before completing my undergraduate education at Northwestern University. I transferred in as a junior. And I can remember the tremendous empowerment and sort of life-transforming effect of the teachers that I was exposed to in literature, in the German language, in philosophy, in mathematics, and in economics. I ended up at graduate school in economics, but my God, I remember reading about existentialism. I remember reading about, Goethe and, stuff. I mean, I don't want to try to show off here by name dropping. I'm just saying I got an education, I think.
It occurs to me, and again, I wish I had said it this way in the book. I define the liberal arts, sciences, social science, humanities, as those fields that are where knowledge is pursued for its own sake. And in some ways, you can cordon that off and say, okay, that's what the professors are doing in their libraries and their labs. They're pursuing knowledge for its own sake. What does that have to do with the liberal arts classroom? And what you're making me realize is, and again, I mean, thanks for mentioning, math, econ. It's not just about the humanities. I think when you study anything for its own sake, for its own internal beauty and logic, you are, I think it models for you that process of discovery that you can then apply. You don't even have to consciously do it. I think it becomes something that you apply to your own life. That sense of exploration, that sense of not I want to get to point B, but let's delve into this and see where we end up. And let's discover things that we never knew were there. And look, even ultimately when you turn it back around, that's actually going to be very practical. I mean, there's a reason why liberal arts majors actually, contrary to popular belief, are highly valued on the job market. I mean, if they're smart kids who got good grades and went to good schools, they are highly valued on the market. They do great on their GREs and their MCATs and their LSATs because they've learned to think, they've learned to explore. They are not just training themselves to fill one particular niche in one particular machine that may, quite frankly, be gone in 10 years. And the thing that drives me crazy, you talk about this kid who says, well, I'm going to major in business because I want to get a job. I think what kids think is going to help them get a job is really doesn't bear a whole lot of relationship to what actually will get them a job. And at the very least, I feel like we need better lines of communication between employers running through parents and teachers down to the kids. Because as it is now, I think most people's information comes from like politicians, pundits, and late night comedians who make jokes about English majors. Without really knowing. I mean, I hear kids say, I want to do X, therefore I'm going to take courses in Y. And I'm like, okay, fine, you want to do X? I'm not going to question that. But who told you that you should take courses in Y if you want to do X? Yeah. That's actually not how it works. Why don't you inform yourself first, but they often don't.
Well, this is a question fit for quantitative analysis. We know what the majors are. We follow people in a set of data about what kind of jobs and careers they have, and we can correlate. So it's entirely possible to know what the employment rate or the average salary or occupational penetration in different occupations of people who are English majors, biology majors, economics majors, and so on. I mean, so, there's no in principle, there should be no mystery there, is what I'm saying.
Well, that's true. And just by the way, I think it's widely reported that technical majors have higher starting salaries than liberal arts majors, and that's true. What isn't widely reported is that difference is almost totally erased within 10 years.
I didn't know that
and
myself.
And it's precisely because you learn to learn. You're not getting that first, that immediate engineering job or whatever it is, which is definitely going to pay better than the bumming around thing that a lot of English majors do after they graduate. But 10 years later, it may well be that the engineer is still pretty much where they started, or a step or two higher, and the liberal arts major has been able to make their way in a much more creative, interesting, and effective way up the career ladder, because they have a wide set of skills and they can continue to sort of retrain themselves, and they're open to many different other kinds of opportunities that don't depend just on one set of technical skills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we might be getting near the end of our time, but I want to ask you about something else in the book, which is what you call the foundational compromise of modern American higher education, the situating of a liberal arts college within the framework of major research university. And right. You just don't think that's a workable arrangement.
Right. I mean, I think it can be adjusted to work. I'm not suggesting that we tear down
these honors colleges, for example.
Totally start over again. Sorry?
I said the honors colleges within the major research university is one example of an adjustment that might be made. I'm just asking you.
Yes. Well, here's the thing. I mean, look, what's the problem for viewers who might not understand what we're talking about? Yeah. We have these things called colleges that ultimately derive from the English colleges, where undergraduates get together for 4 years to have a general education and maybe also do a major and be pointed in a particular professional direction. And then we have these other things called research universities that derive from German institutions that are about the creation of knowledge in all the fields we've been talking about, physicists and economists and art historians. And that's also very important. The problem is that the same professors who are creating the knowledge in their university capacity, let's say, are also in the classroom teaching undergraduates. But because the system prioritizes research, I wouldn't even say it prioritizes research, it's the only priority, right? It's the only way that professors are rewarded is through their research.
That's correct.
Teaching suffers. And everybody knows this. Nobody wants to talk about it outside the academy, but everybody knows it within the academy. The more time you spend on your teaching, the more trouble you're going to get in professionally. That's the contradiction I'm talking about. And my solution is, the liberal arts college, the honors college is one maybe way to address it. But what I really think we need to do is to have two faculty, or at least a situation in which faculty members can be rewarded for their teaching. So let's say you can get tenure if you're a great researcher, you can get tenure if you're a great teacher, you can get tenure if you somehow combine the two in a way that's felt to be valuable. But right now, professors most of them are doing as little as possible with their students, and often, increasingly, outsourcing the real job of teaching to very underpaid adjuncts or graduate students, who effectively are a parallel teaching faculty. They're just a transient, poorly paid, not necessarily well-trained faculty.
Well, I agree. This is a very serious problem, and one sees hanging around in places like Brown evidence of it all the time. One thinks of cases of people coming up for tenure and faculty deliberating, in which the excellent teaching gets like like 2% weight in the overall calculation, and the person is denied tenure because the publication record isn't as good as whatever.
Right.
And one will hear the argument, the counter argument, well, it'd be great to keep this person around, and we do really care about teaching, but on the other hand, if we want to be a top 10 or a top 20 department, so the rating kind of thing is going to come in, and the way that if we want to recruit the best graduate students and so on, so do we lose out when we admit, and I don't know, NYU or Michigan admits, and the prospective graduate student elects to go to NYU or Michigan because
sure,
when they looked at the CVs of the faculty, they found a higher publication rate or whatever.
Right.
So if we want to be players, if we want to feather our own nest as far as our academic careers are concerned, we can't make a different kind of decision than what we've made. And it is true that in many places the classroom responsibilities fall on a cadre of people who are never going to be a sort of permanent and honored and well compensated component of the university community.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you said it exactly right. I mean, it makes, again, given the way the incentives now work, it makes perfect sense for your department to make those decisions. Absolutely. But you end up, I suspect things are a little better than this at Brown, but Harvard is the classic example where you have all these tremendous names on the faculty, and a typical undergraduate will see them at the other end of a large lecture hall, and their actual teaching contact is with graduate students and maybe postdoctoral fellows. And look, there's surveys that talk about how dissatisfied college students are with the teaching they're getting, how unengaged they feel. The problem is there's sort of no feedback loop, right? I mean, because college is still sold based on prestige, and because prestige still has so much to do with the quality of research, even though that has nothing to do with undergraduate teaching, and more to the point with wealth, with institutional wealth. There's no market mechanism, let's put it that way, to incentivize the schools to change the situation that we're talking about. It would take sort of a revolt of consumers, and the consumers are the students and their parents. I mean, I hate the fact that we've gotten to the point where students are thought of as consumers or customers, but as long as that's true, they should use their market power to say, wait a second, I'm not getting much of an education here.
Let me ask you, because our time is running, about two things that seem to be important changes in the environment, and get your thinking about how that affects the concerns that you're expressing in your argument. One of them is globalization with elite college campuses, increasing numbers of international students, if I can call them that. I mean, students are coming from India or from China or from Latin America or Europe. And so American universities are different in their student composition than they would have been 25 years ago in that respect. And then the other is about online distance learning, massive open online courses, and what seems to me a deeply challenging technological development to this kind of market niche that the elite schools have carved out for ourselves.
Right. Well, actually, I mean, in some ways, the two are actually symbiotic rather than contradictory. For the reasons I'll explain. I certainly don't think it's a bad thing that more international students are coming to American college campuses. I mean, for all the obvious reasons. Yeah. But there are problems with the way it's happening, which is that basically the kids who are coming are sort of the same. My perception is that they're the same kinds of kids as these excellent sheep that I've described making it through America's sort of private high schools and affluent public schools. They have the same sorts of goals. They've been trained in a similar way. If anything, they almost certainly skew even more wealthy, because part of the reason schools like these students is because they tend to pay full tuition. Oh, yeah. So what we have is a situation, really, where you have a global elite, which is itself increasingly separating itself from everybody else, a global elite that's coming together at these American institutions of higher learning, because you can go to Japan, you can go to Brazil, you can go to India, and they want to get their kids into Harvard and Yale or Oxford and Cambridge. American, or more broadly Anglo-American higher education, is a huge global cultural brand that everyone's competing to get into, and then sort of this global elite gets together and they establish their connections with each other, and everything's great for them. Whether it's great for anybody else is a different question. And then sort of as a result, partly of that, I've heard from people all over the world, really, from all the countries I mentioned and a bunch more, saying, hey, it's the same situation here that you describe as being in America, this kind of hoop jumping, sort of empty ambition for the sake of self-aggrandizement. So by becoming global institutions, these schools are diffusing what I think is a pernicious educational model throughout the globe. I would also say, part of the narrative of globalization these days is that the elite is no longer connected to any particular country, and therefore doesn't have any allegiance to that country. And people also say that about multinational corporations. Of course, we see this in this phenomenon of inversion, right, where Burger King, is now going to become Canadian. This is also happening at our most wealthy, prestigious institutions, right? They have campuses around the world.
Indeed, they do.
They see themselves in a global context. I mean, never mind Harvard not being a responsible citizen of Cambridge, which has been true for a long time. It's not even. It's moving towards not being a responsible citizen of the United States because it sees its destiny in a global context. Now, you talk about the MOOCs, massive open online courses. I hate them. Probably not surprising. I think it's lousy education. Let's talk about the fact that only 4% of people who start finish. I mean, I think they're great if you already know how to teach yourself. Most of the people who finish have college degrees. If you want to acquire a specific specific amount of usually technical knowledge, they're terrific and good for them. But they are not going to help 18-year-olds learn how to teach themselves, let alone become an adult. So what are we going to end up with? And the people who are pushing the MOOCs, who are the head of these companies, will say this. They won't say we're going to make college obsolete. They're going to say that in 10 years or in 50 years, the only institutions that are going to exist anymore are the high-flying, brand-named global universities, Harvard, Cambridge, Stanford, and everybody else is going to be going to college online, which means that the elite are going to continue to get this deluxe, boutique, face-to-face education that's about making connections with each other and continuing to feather their nest, and everyone else is going to be eating at McDonald's.
Yeah.
So to speak, educationally speaking.
No, I get that. On the other hand, if you're in a village, somewhere in Kenya or Uganda or, Bangladesh, and you want to learn electricity and magnetism or price theory or, linear algebra, I mean, you're going to have an opportunity to do that.
Okay.
You're going to be able to hear from some of the best people in the world about that.
Okay, but listen.
Yeah.
I know that's the myth, or that's the example. First of all, how is this really happening? I mean, let's think about this. The kid in Bangladesh needs a high-speed connection. The kid in Bangladesh needs a computer. The kid in Bangladesh, before they can learn about linear algebra or just even algebra, is going to need a school where they can learn arithmetic. So this myth that this is really... There was actually an article in the Times magazine a year or two ago about a kid in Mongolia who is at MIT now. He's a math genius. He was discovered through the MOOCs. If you read the article, what you find out is that he didn't just have a MOOC. There was a Mongolian professional who had come back and was actually working with him one-on-one. So what he really had was what's known as a mixed classroom, where you leverage online resources. Good, that's fine. But you also need a teacher to help you learn. That can be a great model. It is not, however, a model that saves money. It costs just as much. Yeah. So this notion that we're going to kind of do it all on the cheap and it's going to make higher education available to everybody around the world, I think that that's really kind of propaganda. And that's not what the MOOC people are really after. What they're really after is replacing public higher education and getting paid to do it. They're not in the business of giving anything away. That's a loss leader. They're in the business of making money.
replacing public higher education and leaving the
Yeah.
preserve of elite private education for the 1% of the 1% who will still be able to avail themselves of it.
Yeah, I mean, you probably know about what happened in California with San Jose State.
I don't.
The MOOCs, they're all headquartered in California. The tech industry has a very strong lobby in the state legislature. And they got the state legislature to pass a bill that did the key thing that they wanted to have happen, which is to say, we will pay you to offer MOOC courses to our students, and they can get regular college credit for it. So that's the beginning of the replacement of public higher education by MOOCs. You can now get credit. They ran the pilot project at San Jose State, and it was an enormous failure because these courses kind of suck. And they had pass rates. One of them had a pass rate of 50%, and the other two had a pass rate of 25%. And these were in basic math classes that MOOCs are supposed to be good at teaching. So that's the ultimate business model. That's really what they're after. I mean, they are for-profit companies, right? They're not really just going to be in the business of educating kids in Mongolia for free. Yeah.
All right. Bill Deresiewicz, thank you very much for coming on and spending some time talking about your book. There's a lot more to say. Maybe we'll get to another conversation about massive online. I've been recruited by some colleagues here to contribute some lectures to something that they're trying to put together. Now I have some second thoughts about that.
Okay. Well, I'd love to talk some more. This was a very interesting discussion.
Great. Take care now.